We're like playing chicken right now. Like,
thought
which one
Shannon
of us
was
is going to
gonna
do?
Oh. Shannon tends to be the person who likes to do the intro because she doesn't do the intro very often.
That kind of sounds like a paradox. Anyway, welcome to the Depression Vacation podcast, where I'm no good at intros, but I try them anyway.
Yeah. So yeah, we have a very special guest with us who's actually wanted to be on the podcast for a while, but we haven't figured out a time and space for him to do it until right now.
Hooray!
So you've probably seen him on the graphic already, as per usual, unless you're just a subscriber. But guest, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, yes. Hello, friends. I'm Ben Chadwell.
You do have a very nice radio voice.
Yeah, that's a good voice.
That was
Been
nice and
told.
smooth. That was like
you.
butter.
A little bit of ASMR voice. It's interesting because like I actually randomly mentioned the topic of ASMR just in passing to Christine on Friday, and she was like, "No, don't like it, don't like it, don't like it."
I love that.
And I was like,
Crinkling
"Oh, you know,
bags and
Ryan
such.
is trying to get into ASMR speaking."
Ryan loves ASMR. Sometimes I'll come home and all the lights will be off, and I just hear like the sound of scissors. And I'm like, what is happening? You go into the bedroom. He's
That's like a
listening
serial
to
killer moment, Jan.
No, he likes the haircuts. The haircuts are we should have. But yeah, that's his thing. He likes ASMR. I find it a little creepy sometimes, but
Did his mother cut his hair growing up or something?
he apparently, actually, I just found this out. He did not like haircuts growing up, and because we just went to go get his haircut the other day, and he was like, "Did you know I used to hate getting haircuts?" I'm like, "Really? Is that right?" So that's the story.
Now he's addicted to them, apparently.
I suppose.
That's what happens.
My strange
Yeah.
haircuts. Haircuts.
Yeah. Ben, tell us a little bit about
origins.
yourself.
Yeah,
Addiction.
getting back on topic here.
Oh, so yeah, let's see. I know you guys through
Yeah.
improv.
Vid Jam
Hal is
stuff.
one of those people in Harrisburg that I feel like it makes me feel grateful to be around in this area. Like there are certain people I think of, and you're one of those individuals who bring people together to collaborate creatively in ways that probably wouldn't happen if you didn't initiate.
Oh,
So,
this is a very George Bailey moment here.
Oh,
Thank
that was
you.
very sweet.
Yeah, thank you, Ben.
and Shannon, I don't know you too well yet.
Shannon's here.
But I guess I know Ryan a little bit better since he's
Yeah.
our very talented accompanist for the offbeats.
But it's a fun way to, like, you were talking about like bringing people in for collaboration, and I feel like that's kind of just the way it happens. Is like the more you get people involved with different sorts of people, the more you just discover somebody who could be an asset to you in a different like artistic group. Like Ryan definitely was like, you know, because the original idea of Offbeats, I remember, Ben, you and I were the accompanists, and the idea was like one would play music while the other one was singing, and that didn't work out too well because it was just like too much chaos on stage.
Right.
And so when we were looking for a permanent accompanist, I remember Ryan playing the Zelda theme in the church piano and like playing piano songs, and I'm like, well, maybe Ryan would be good at this. And now he's become a very loving, very nice, respected, and useful sounds wrong, but
That's the first thing I think of when I think of Ryan. He's very useful. I put it in my vows.
He turned the church into the temple of time.
Yeah, it was the Kokiri thing, actually, because I
Yes.
remember every time I hear da 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 da
the
da,
Kokiri.
I think
Yeah.
of
Lost
Ryan
Words,
dressed as a
yeah.
priest in the back of that church.
Sorry, forgive me for I was ignorant of which particular magical song it was.
But yeah, I did want to talk a little bit too about your your filmmaking too is another interesting aspect of Ben, because when I was like just doing mental notes about like what I wanted to talk about with you on the podcast. You still, and I've told you this many times, have one of my favorite shots in the entire history of VidJam, which at this point is probably like 300-ish movies going over like 8 years. In the very first VidJam, you did a film where you had you and your co-star were like dancing silhouettes at the Harrisburg train station. Mm-hmm. And just the way the light caught that, it reminded me very much of a shot from Punch Drunk Love that like is still to this day like... I kind of have a bit of a photographic memory about VidJam movies, and that particular one always sticks with me. I say I have a photographic memory, but I can't remember the name of the movie.
Oh, it's called A Sanctuary in Time.
I knew it was something in time.
Yes. Yeah. That was my kind of initial foray into more serious filmmaking. And the only other thing that I have to, the reason I'm calling it that is before, I think the last like movie I made was in middle school maybe, or like elementary school, which I still have, and they're quite funny. Not always intentionally, but
I can attest to that.
It's been a lot of fun for me. I've always been a big ham. My parents, when I was a child, went to a parenting class titled "The Spirited Child." To put it nicely.
Were you a pleasure to have in class?
I was a pleasure to have in class.
Yeah, weren't we all?
Well, I feel like a walking conundrum in many ways, and I was hoping to kind of get to some thoughts that I've been having. I mean, when I first heard the title of your podcast, "Depression Vacation," I was like, "Wait, I have a lot to talk about when it comes to depression." And maybe if I'm on the show, it won't be so much of a depression vacation as a depression
staycation.
Let's see, I don't know, like going down a mine shaft and. I don't know, but
a depression excavation.
Excavation,
a regenerative mining excavation, if such a thing exists. Yeah. But so what did I want to say about that?
You were saying that our parents, having to go through special classes for us because we were interesting children.
Yeah, I've always felt emotions very strongly, and as with most children, I expressed them freely, and until it became sort of untenable to do that.
Yeah,
and I remember this one particular moment in middle school, and I was on the like morning news channel. Yeah. Like we had our own version of like Will It Float on David Letterman called Is It Buoyant?
That's so much better title,
with an original like middle school kid playing a trumpet. I think the song was like, "Is it buoyant? Is it buoyant? Is it buoyant?"
Do you have copies of this still?
No. I mean, I wonder if Mr. Briant, that was the teacher he was the computer teacher who helped us with it. He might have some. Well, I don't know how I feel about that, but anyway. So I remember doing some of those recordings, and I was very like animated, and my homeroom teacher, who generally I really liked, kind of told me I was making a fool of myself.
Isn't that the worst?
And I was sharing sort of my creativity. Yes, it was, maybe a little bit weird, but the intentions were always good.
Yeah.
And I just hadn't run into, you run into this kind of experiences with a little bit of shame that sort of then quiet that creative impulse or restrain it so that you're afraid to share it with people.
I think it's all in the we've talked a little bit on this podcast about how weird is actually normal because we're all like the curse of humanity is that we're all fully actualized individuals. So there is no normal because not every single person is so different. And I think that the shame that they made you feel, because this was similar to my upbringing too, I was made to feel a lot of shame, somewhat rightfully, somewhat not rightfully, for being sort of acting out this in similar ways that you were talking, Ben. And I think a lot of it is to try to get you to conform more to what the normal world is, whatever that means, in society.
Yeah, the goal so often, and with treatment for what we call mental illness too, is getting you to. There was almost this assumption that there is a certain way to function that you want to function, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That there is a concept, an idea, this sort of abstraction for what the right way to be is in our culture, our society. And that is seen as what is healthy or what is right, and what is well functioning. But I have so many questions about those assumptions, and I think it's important to examine them.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting, like, having dated somebody for a while who was a therapist. I've heard a lot of, like, sort of the inside things about what therapists actually do, what their, like, code of ethics is, and like what the function of the therapist is in somebody's own mental health journey. And I thought the most interesting thing was that, like, what you were talking about just a second ago, Ben, you were saying that, you have to figure out how you actually want to function within society, like what about your behavior you want to change or what you want to feel differently. And that is that is the entire journey in a patient-therapist scenario, because the therapist really isn't supposed to give you advice on things, but just supposed to lead you to places where you can make your own conclusions for yourself. Because the best way I can describe it is kind of like Inception, from what I've heard. Like, you can't just tell somebody, oh, split up your father's empire. You have to, like, go deep into his brain and plant the idea so that he thinks that he thought to split up his parents' empire.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be the goal.
I think that something that I've experienced is you had mentioned about, your teachers kind of curbing that part of you that was maybe too loud or too bombastic. And I suffered that a lot in school. And I feel like a lot of them are, in their minds, have the right intentions of, like, I'm trying to prepare these kids to go out into civilized life and, like, how to manage themselves in a group setting, and there are some unintended consequences with that. I feel that there are still times that I think about from when I was in middle school, high school, where teachers and even other kids were like, "You're being annoying," rather than trying to find ways to channel that into a strength. And I think that's something I still carry with me for sure.
Yeah, some of my teachers, like, some of them I think were what you were talking about, like, they just wanted us to behave, because I was, like, around 7th grade, I started to be able to channel things into better things, but, like, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, especially 6th grade, I was kind of a mess. But a lot of the teachers I had just, like, were actually just mean, if I think about it. Like, they never really gave me any functional advice. They were just always sort of annoyed by me, and somewhat weirdly took a little bit of pleasure in when kids would, like, ostracize me or something like that. Because, I mean, teachers are human beings like anybody. You can, I guarantee teachers dislike some of their students and like some of their students as much as they try to treat them reasonably. But, like, it's tough when you're, like, a student who's growing up and not in a position of any sort of authority, and the authority figure clearly doesn't like you. And, that was Catholic school. A lot of very old women, all of whom are probably dead now, who were teaching me. And some were very nice. Some were just didn't like me. So, which is fine. I'm a lot.
Yeah. Well, I generally liked my teachers. I mean, there were some that our personalities just kind of clashed or you didn't see eye to eye. But in general, I liked them. And the thing that, because I agree that the goal of therapy is not so much to direct you to a certain, ideology or ism. At least that would be what I would think good therapy is. But sometimes the product takes the shape of the tool. This is kind of a pattern I think I've recognized somewhere, especially doing like permaculture design work, is like when you're using software, for example, especially if you're a beginner, it kind of forces you into grid thinking. Squares, quadrilaterals, very angular, geometric shapes. And so if you're using that software to design the built environment or landscape an area, there's a good chance it will take the form of the morphology that is kind of imposed by the software. And I see kind of a parallel with the way the therapists are trained, or for example, like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, seen as the gold standard because there's a lot of data to back up that it works. So it apparently creates good outcomes for a lot of people. But it has been so frustrating for me to, philosophically be copacetic with that toolkit, or kind of think like, well, all of this I learned as a child, and I need something more than this. I know that I get into certain patterns of thought that I can get caught in. But the cognitive, like the 12 cognitive distortions, disqualifying the positive and fortune telling and all that, like I can know I'm engaging in them. And I know some coping techniques and things to maybe temporarily deal with the thought or find evidence for and against the thought and do all that investigative work to find out if something is true or not. And I think too much for my own good. I think I'm too self-aware because I just run circles around these things.
Yeah.
So the self-awareness is actually hurting me. And I feel backwards to a lot of what seems to be the mainstream patient, or what you would think of when you think of a patient. Because a lot of therapy, if it's not CBT, which awareness is a tool in there as well, it's talk therapy. And seems like the underlying philosophy is kind of, if we shine a light on it, if you are able to identify it and see it, there's a certain magic to that. And I think that's kind of true. Like,
yeah,
you sort of maybe below the conscious level work with that a little bit. But for me, the more I've become aware, sometimes the less empowered I feel, because I don't feel like the therapists I've had, as well intentioned as they are really equipped to deal with what's going on inside.
What you're talking
on
about,
a soul level.
I've had a couple, I used to get into a lot of these thought patterns too, because this was something I talked about with my therapist in the early days of doing therapy for the first time. And it was sort of like, I'm only doing this thing for this reason, but am I feeling guilty because this reason is not the right thing? So is that going to make me do the right thing? But then is that the wrong thing because I'm doing it for the wrong reason?
Right.
And then this whole charade would just triangulate back into itself over and over again. And the thing he told me actually was he said it's good and mature to be able to recognize your patterns of behavior in that case, but it's also important to just focus on what makes you he's a good way to turn your brain off was not the phrase that he wanted to use, because obviously therapists don't want us turning our brains off. But he said mostly, which this was very useful for me in my daily life, to just focus on the things that would make me keep a log about things that would make me happy, things that would make me sad, and don't discount the sad things, but just try to focus more on what makes you happy and your relationship to that in your daily life. And that's actually been mostly pretty helpful. I mean, I've got days where my brain spins in a million different directions too, but I am better now than I was 6 years ago when I started therapy. So
that's good.
Yeah.
Something I'd like to go back to what you had mentioned about self-awareness, and that's something that a lot of therapists that I've had over the years will pick out about me. They'll be like, "Oh, you're very self-aware. You understand why it is you feel a certain way or why you're doing what you're doing." And in some cases, they kind of praise you for that, and in other cases, that's kind of the root of the problem, right? Because I feel very defeated with how we approach that sometimes. When I have the intrusive thought, immediately I'm like, this is the thought distortion, this is why I feel that way, and it's illogical to feel that way. And that's what sends me into the tailspin of being like, well, why? If I know that this is incorrect, then why do I feel this way? And that's something that I've struggled with very intensely for the last couple of years.
Right. There are a few steps beyond that never seem to get to in the 45 minutes, whatever, that they give you in therapy.
And you always get into the deepest thing accidentally 10 minutes before your session is over.
Now I'm ready for therapy. Oh, it's over.
Yeah.
Can I buy another hour, please?
Right. But I think the other sort of piece to, at least the way I experience despair and depression, is much less individual and much more community-oriented or cultural, philosophical-oriented, which, again, is not something that a lot of therapists are trained to handle or help you navigate.
Yeah.
Those philosophical questions, those existential questions, but so part of me, at the very foundation of this is, well, is what I'm experiencing Is it sort of a pathological experience that is distressing to me, and I want to rid myself of it, or at least feel more liberated or be able to manage it? And or is this a human response to the ongoing trauma and grief I feel around what's happening in my community and in the world and the way that people think?
It can be a lot.
I feel very isolated for the way I think or for my worldview. If I talk to a therapist about, well, I'm experiencing eco grief. Mm-hmm. I'm aware we're in the, we're perpetuating the 6th mass extinction on this planet. That's incredibly sad.
This is actually a big topic of discussion in children's therapy these days, particularly, is a lot of, specifically teenagers, are incredibly stressed. Like, they call it exactly that. They're stressed over climate change and like the idea that the world is ending right before their eyes, essentially. And a lot of them feel this idea of hopelessness. It's like, well, what's the point of me growing up and doing anything if, as you say, we're in the 6th mass extinction event that's coming up? So.
Well, it's happening, and it's happening right now. And but Ben, you got to focus on only what you can control. I'm like, okay, but
that's the thing is
you can control a lot. We have a lot of influence. We have all these tools. Like, what's stopping you from right now creating a GoFundMe for some cause that's close to your heart and raising all this money? Like.
Even that, I think, is a little bit too this was a weird lesson I actually kind of learned by working at WITF, was that a lot of the stuff that was focused here was focused on local politics and things like that. And I used to kind of feel a lot more the same way as you, Ben. It's like, well, what can you do globally to change the world? But sometimes, like, you're a permaculturist. Like, that's something you're doing good for the environment right there. Mm-hmm. Like, you're actually doing good, and you are doing things that make a tangible difference, even on a smaller scale. Like, and the idea is, like, there's only so much one individual can do. And so, like, if everybody did things on the same scale as Ben, the world would have a significant tangible difference.
That's one of the things, though, is you end up and when you are making a positive impact, is you end up feeling, like you said, very isolated because you think to yourself, and this was a similar conversation I had with some of my colleagues as, where we manage banks. And so on one level, we do get a lot of fulfillment from, helping small business owners, helping people get out of debt, things like that, or helping people with fraud, as we mentioned in a previous episode. And, those things are very impactful and very positive, but it also makes you feel like, God, why doesn't everybody do this? Like, why? It makes you wonder, like, why do we have these problems? Like, if I can recognize that we are in the 6th mass extinction of the planet, what is going on in the brains of all these other people? It makes you feel like the crazy one.
Well, yeah. So this is where my sense of grief and depression over climate change and everything comes from a completely different area, Ben, because like I was raised in a very conservative household. My dad still does not believe he keeps calling it global warming. And he still does not believe it exists whatsoever.
Call it global weirding. That might help. Because
I like that.
It's pretty hard to deny that things are not what they used to be, especially across his lifetime.
Well, that's what I keep trying to point out, just little tangible things. Like this year, for instance, the weather patterns in the Northeast have been absolutely bonkers. Like, it's been 60 degrees one day and then 8 inches of very wet, packy snow the next day. And I've just subtly, I've gotten to the point where I'm just trying to incept my parents. And I was having a conversation with my mom, like, yeah, don't you remember when we were kids, the first snow would fall and we would have nothing, snow would be on the ground the entire time until March. Don't you remember that, Mom? Yeah. When's the last time you can remember that happened? Oh, I don't know. And remember, we have 2 ponds in our neighborhood, too. And I'm like, remember you said when you were a little girl, you could skate on the ponds because they were frozen solid from, January and February on. So, oh, yeah, well, why can't we do that with these ponds these days?
Yeah, why is that? And I think that's a good approach. Asking people questions is much more likely to have them open up or be open to other perspectives than telling them they're wrong, they can't think that way. Then it becomes an ideology. But there are these sort of despair narratives, as Charles Eisenstein would
Disparatives.
Disparatives, exactly. Despair narratives, and that that keep us from taking action. And it's almost a despair narrative, now that I think of it, to say, well, there's only so much you can control. And what's isolating is, okay, I have this knowledge, this insight. I've developed this wisdom, gathered these tools, made these connections. But where is the receptivity in the culture to what I have to offer as a gift? And there's so little of it. I look around and there's just the built environment. A lot of the design is very stupid.
Yeah.
And especially like suburban developments where if any kind of event happened, basically they'd be shit out of luck.
Because they're
can't unwalkable. They can't reach anything without their car. They're totally dependent on the grid, and that's kind of when problems arise in environments and systems. Usually, it's due to a certain concentration of something, and so, for instance. If all the electricity generation is concentrated in one area, or all the sources of water have been pooled into one spot, that makes them very vulnerable to, failure or attack or
natural disasters.
Yeah.
Natural disasters. It's not a very resilient way of building a system, and so we have these zoning is sort of a way of concentrating residential space here and food growing areas here. And so on and so forth, so that it makes it impossible sometimes to integrate systems to meet human needs. And this sort of feeds into every aspect of human life is a potential gold mine for a corporation to commoditize, whether it's your time, like, oh, I don't have time to spend with my kid and they need daycare. That's an opportunity to profit.
Yeah.
Things we used to provide for ourselves, and this happened to indigenous people all over the world again and again, but I'll remind you, we're all indigenous to somewhere. And we had this sort of economics of resilient self-support that the way the economy is sort of set up now, the business as usual economy, exploits certain aspects of our lives. But not to get too much into a despair thing, because...
Well, you had a lot of good things I want to go back to and talk about. For starters, like talking about suburban design, which actually is very bad too. As a quick aside, I remember I kind of got a little bit happy this week because about a year and a half ago when gas was like $5 a gallon, I used to be an avid biker a lot more, and I tried to bike to work one day on my day off just to see how feasible it was. And just because of the road systems and everything, it was a terror nightmare trying to get in there because there was no shoulder on like my Foley Mill Road where I work.
Right.
However, a coworker of mine had pointed out that because we were just talking about like he lives very close to the lottery building, and I'm like, well, yeah, you could walk to work if your car died. And he's like, I would never walk down that highway though. I would just take the back roads. And I was like, back roads? What? And apparently there's like a route that goes through like all the developments back there that I'm gonna try the next time I'm in bike shape and have a day off. But the idea of like these suburban centers like are so far away from everything, and you have to drive. And I was actually reading something a couple of months ago too, talking about the difference, because Japan has like an obesity rate that's like 10% of its population, as opposed to the U.S. is like 60-ish or 65. And they were pointing out part of the reason Japan, they have better quality food for starters, but also the way all of their cities and prefectures are designed is that people will just walk to a public transport and then take the public transport. So they're walking tens of thousands of steps every day to get to public transport. And that has a double effect that you don't really need to do exercise for recreation. So the design of their cities also, I think this was great, and I wish that they had done this in school. Lunch is a class for children in Japan. Like what they do is it is your lunch, you eat it, but it's also a class in nutrition and what you need to feed yourself to actually have a healthy diet. So, and I thought all this was like really like, I wish this had been American culture.
Right. It's well integrated.
Yeah.
Right.
I got Ben off of his train of thought. Sorry.
Well, it's okay. I mean, you bring up a lot of good points and worth investigating. And the suburbs are such a strange place.
Yeah.
And I think it's helpful if you want to kind of ask why are things the way they are, or get kind of a look, almost an out of body look, because if you've lived in the suburbs, it's hard to see them for what they are, or how kind of strange they are, or be able to ask questions about them. So there's this one exercise called Anthropologist from Mars, and so you're a scientist, you're a researcher, you come to Earth, and with the goal of observing how the human beings live. And so what would an anthropologist from Mars observe happening in the suburbs? Okay, well, everybody gets in their car and leaves around the same time. Most of people's, what they call their home is empty for most of the hours of the day. There are vast swaths of low-growing lawn plant, this plant life, vegetation. And they come home and pretty much all at the same time, which is kind of weird. And maybe if we change that a little bit, things wouldn't be so busy and understaffed all the time. I don't know. But
we were changing it though, Ben. Like the pandemic and like the whole work from home
and
thing.
that shows you how fast things can change and regenerate. I mean, like we saw those dolphins return to the canals of Venice, and nature is there. Nature has this regenerative power. And again, just using the word nature almost throws me down another rabbit hole, because nature is not something out there. I almost don't want to use the word nature.
We are a part of nature.
We are nature. And to get all cosmological and spiritual here, which I feel like is really this is where we need to go in order to be solutionary. Because it's not technology that's going to be our savior. And that's kind of one of those narratives that Elon Musk is going to save us. We got to... By any means possible, the greatest good is perpetuating the human species. And how do we do that? Well, we need another planet, because we're living this way, and we want to live the same way we're living here on another planet. We want to, not necessarily want to, but we're bringing an exploitative system to a whole nother world to continue that sort of violent process. And there's nothing there. Earth is beautiful, and it's the foundation of Western economics is scarcity. The foundational assumption is that resources are scarce. And, you think about billionaires who still it's not enough for them. They need more. There's this hole in them they can't fill. And why do they feel that way? And maybe it's because we don't feel that there is ever enough. That's sort of an underlying philosophy that it's hard to see operating.
We talk about this a lot at Lottery, obviously, since I work for the Lottery, and our job is giving away large swaths of untenable money that you would never see anywhere else to a single person some days. And the question is always kind of what would you do with that money? And it's interesting to talk to certain people or witnesses that come by, because you have the billionaire mindset in a lot of people. It's oh man, I would do this, I'd do this, I'd do this. And then you have the pragmatic kind of we've all grown up where we're never going to be millionaires or billionaires. And then you hear kind of okay, I would pay off my mortgage, I'd invest a little bit of money and probably just live off of the money the rest of it. There's a CPA I work with who said that if he won $350,000 in the lottery, he could probably retire in 5 years because he would know what to invest it in. He would know exactly what CDs to put it in, that he could just live off the interest. Right. And I'm wow, $350,000 is not a lot of money as far as they want you to believe. In fact, $1 billion is a bonkers amount of money for anybody to have. You get to a point where it's almost impossible to spend that money unless you buy a football team or something like that. And then
there's this tension, and I see this in myself a lot, between wanting to be successful in the system as it is, because I thirst for that security. Capitalism is the parent that I rely on, and I want it to approve of what I'm doing. That's in my brain somewhere.
So here's the deal with
and then the other side of that tension, or it's sort of connected to, I guess you would call the opposite of that, where it's the thirst for freedom, for liberation, for being that full expression. And I think the way I like to relate this sometimes is, what makes, for example, if you have a pet, what makes a dog the happiest is when the conditions are there for the dog to be the most dog it can be. And when you impose conditions on a dog or another animal that prevents it from doing its thing from being that dog, or a chicken from being that chicken, that's when you get into environmental problems. You create concentrations of like, huge poultry operations, where that becomes a pollution problem. Chickens doing what they do, maybe it could be fertilizer, and they sell it as fertilizer. But when you have concentrations of waste products, that in nature really there is no waste, but chickens, they have a lot of functions ecologically. Let's just say, I'm using them as an example for the sort of in the food growing agricultural sense, but they microtill, they eat pests, they provide fertilizer. So there's these things that they do just by being chickens, and it makes them very, very happy, and they're part of this system that they're an important part of this. They're serving the system just by being who they are, and I feel for humans that is a big part of this kind of nebulous despair that I think a lot of us feel inside. Is we're not really allowing ourselves, we are restrained in some way from being what a human is, and even one step beyond that, from being, for example, who Hal is, or who Shannon is, or who I am. If I can't be me, that is not a recipe for happiness. But I carry around that fear that there is not going to be enough for me because things are scarce, and I have to grind and work. Hashtag rise and grind, and there's the carrots out there that you could live like this. You want this, which I don't necessarily. That's confusing to me because I don't want what is seen as the thing to aspire to. But anyway, these are thoughts and ideas that kind of turn things around a little bit, or I guess that sort of demonstrate how learning more about permaculture and how living systems work has informed or persuaded or changed the way that I see a lot of our systems operating.
Yeah, permaculture is something that interests me because my parents accidentally have sort of a permaculture yard out of sheer laziness. My dad really because he's a child of like the 50s and 60s and like a big pro-capitalist and big white picket fence guy. And so he's often lamenting. He's like, man, my yard looks like garbage all the time. There's all this like different kinds of grass and greens growing in there. And I'm like, well, Dad, actually, that's more healthy for the ecosystem. The fact that you have a lot of mixed greens essentially in your lawn is better than like your neighbors who have like nothing but Kentucky blue across the street or something. And you're like, rah, rah, rah. But laziness overwrites capitalism in that case, which is a weird combination.
Well, sort of the conservative way and the liberal way can often come full circle, because you have like more on the conservative side usually is where the preppers live.
That's true.
And the goal is to be as off the grid, self-reliant as possible. Unfortunately, it often involves a lot of tools of violence, guns, and stockpiling weapons and ammo and things like that, which sort of, I just want to say to them that is not like being able to defend yourself in a violent way is not necessarily security, because relationships are security. If you have relationships with your neighbors, probably they're not going to threaten you.
It's funny you say that, because I was just about to say that what is missing from the doomsday prepper mentality is the sense of community. Like you, for instance, wanting to be somebody who's off the grid and has permaculture and is able to live off the land, that's a community-based solution, because it takes more than just you to, like, on a larger scale, be able to do that. So you, like you said, have relationships with your neighbors. Right. You trust your people, because it boils down to trust. Whereas the doomsday prepper substitutes trust and human connections for weapons of violence, which not only is not healthy for everyone else in the world, but that's just something that's going to make that person crazy, paranoid, and unhappy.
Something that fascinates me, and I've talked about it in other ways before on the podcast before, is this idea of when we put humans in a unusual situation. So, thinking kind of like Lord of the Flies and that kind of thing. And we had talked about Squid Game and Squid Game's the challenge. And something that I've recognized in these pop culture examples of what would happen if we did XYZ, is that I often see that what we recognize is the people in these situations who are in it for themselves, who have that billionaire mindset of like, I don't have enough, I need more, I need to be, I'm number one. They always fail. They always do. And the people who make it to the end are the ones who recognize that community-based trust and the ones who work together. Even in a situation as Squid Game The Challenge, when they brought it kind of to a real-life scenario, the same exact thing happened, where at the end of the game, it was two people who had made connections, and they were friendly with each other when they got to the end of the game too. So I think that's very interesting and kind of like we're writing our own script for success, but we're not following it.
Yeah, that's the same with Survivor too. Like outside of the first maybe 2 seasons of Survivor, I haven't watched any of it. My parents absolutely love it. Like they watch every season like nonstop. And that was a lesson that the Survivor people learned like in the very first season when there was no blueprint to play the game. The people who formed alliances with each other absolutely trampled and were able to way out-scheme the individuals who were in the game. And now it's like, by season 2, people had realized that. And now it's a trope so much that it was a joke on The Office 15 years ago to form alliances, because that's the only way you make it through a game like that, is to bond with your fellow human. And so, like, if it works for Survivor, why shouldn't it work for regular life? Like, I would like to think that all of us are richer having made friends and not been in isolation. And like you were saying earlier, Ben, like creative collaboration is a big deal too. Because for me, at least, that's what helps me keep the demons at bay and not think about necessarily the futility of what I can possibly do to try to make the world a better place, is kind of like the good place axiom, that just like being kind and good to your fellow human is enough to create the kind of world that you want to do. Which we're not perfect. We can't always be kind and good to each other all the time because it's very mood dependent. But, you know, trying to make that a base reality, I think, is kind of what keeps me happier. I don't want to say I'm happy, but happier in general. Just like knowing you've done your level best to try to just make life a little bit better. There's a Simpsons artist that I think he lives in Australia or Scotland, one of the two, that I adore. And he does these like reinterpretations of characters from The Simpsons, but in very like deep mental health sort of ways. And he did this issue on Barney, who's the drunk of Springfield, that absolutely had me cry. Like I bought the edition of it because it had me crying when I was reading it. And it's Barney going through, and he's talking about, like, when you go through Barney's life, he's actually accomplished a lot. He was an award-winning filmmaker, a helicopter pilot. He almost went to space. And he's talking about, it's like, I've done all these things, but I'm still unhappy. There's still something missing from me inside. And that's why I drink and I drink and I drink and I drink. And, like, the very end of, like, a very long and sad lament, Lenny comes up to him and is like, you know, Barney, I think you're thinking about this the wrong way. There's more to life than just the things you've done. It's, you have to think about all the relationships you've made. Think about all the people in this world who would be sad if you suddenly disappeared and whose lives are better even on a tangible way just because you exist. And I think it's bigger than you think it is. And that was a very sweet thing to me, just like the mere act of existing and making life a little bit better for the people in your purview, I think, is enough to justify existence.
Well, that's really beautiful. But
it's not my thought either. It's somebody else's thought. Just want to clarify.
Who would Bart have to land on in the opening sequence if Barney died?
Yeah.
I think
who else would...
something that, and we're talking about this idea of like this overall despair, and that I think we all feel. I think on some level we all recognize that things are shit and they're going to continue to be shit for a while, but probably through the rest of time. But given that, I think what gives me a lot of hope and a lot of optimism in general is going back to this idea of even when we imagine the worst possible thing, even when we imagine like, and I'm going to go back to pop culture here, things like the Hunger Games, things like, that was the first thing that came to my brain, and I didn't come up with any more examples. But
I think Hunger Games just works as a ubiquitous whatever.
I think as a community of humans, we recognize that in those situations, yes, you're going to have people who band together for ill intentions. People who, and even now, what's disheartening is that the people who do not have the best intentions, who are only out for themselves, right now, they have the resources. That's why we hear them so much. Is they have the voice to use, and they have the platform to use it. And I think what gives me a lot of hope is that I recognize, in even at the very worst, there is going to be a collection of people, a community who are recognizing the importance of community, recognize the importance of working together for a common good. And that gives me a lot more hope than some things, because I know I won't be alone come the end,
I think the thing that gives me some hope in that respect, too, which is something I bring up in arguments with conservatives, usually my parents mostly a lot, is that there are blueprints to do these things sustainably. Lots of European countries have sort of cracked the code. When the extreme wealth periods of the 70s, 80s, and 90s were around, the United States just kind of gave most of it back to billionaires, but the European cities used it as taxes to invest in their infrastructure in cities. And so now you have places like the Netherlands is a very bikeable, bike culture is very big there. And, healthcare taken care of, just a kinder atmosphere in general. In fact, I was reading something about, they were talking about the opioid crisis on NPR yesterday, and there was an article talking about how Portugal actually had an 85% reduction in opioid use just through the use of free clinics and counseling and things to get people off of opiates in a way that wasn't going to wreck their lives, whereas the U.S. has spent 3 times as much money for law enforcement to prosecute people who've overdone opioids and send them to jail, and the result is much more expensive, much more miserable, much more cruel, and not as good for anybody.
Yeah, and there are so many examples all around the world of that kind of thing where small groups here and there, or even larger movements, like the African countries who are working to build an enormous green wall. They're calling it by planting billions of trees.
I haven't heard about this at all.
Along the southern border of the Sahara Desert to prevent encroaching desertification. That's using a biological solution, something that nature has developed itself. Nature solves problems. Ecosystems solve problems. That's why biomimicry is so important. To employ biology on this mass cooperative effort between countries and peoples and different language speakers. There's so many stories like this where the solutions are there, they're existing, they're happening right now. People are engaging in them, but they are not often without kind of investment propping them up or subsidies yet valued by the system as it is.
Yeah.
And but they provide so many other forms of capital, which we talk about a lot in permaculture, and not to turn everything into economic speak, because that can be dangerous too. But buying and selling the sky with carbon credits, for example, is something that's been sort of brought up by some indigenous groups. Just that way of thinking about the atmosphere. Can we buy it and sell it by offsetting carbon? Sometimes I feel like maybe that's going a little too far, because we have a burning fire under our feet, and we just I don't care if people are doing it for the totally wrong reasons right now. If we can sequester more carbon and reconnect ecosystems and do things that are sort of regenerative for people and planet, those need to happen. And like now, this is a crisis, but the solutions are there. People are doing them, but it's often hard to make a living as the economy stands. So much of it comes back to how do we expand, how do we value, and not just value, but GDP, for example, gross domestic product, which is we like to have one big number that tells us if the economy is good or bad.
Sure.
And in order for GDP to have a positive indication of where the economy is. It has to be growing all of the time.
That's one of the weaknesses of capitalism.
Right, and there's interest, there's debt laden with interest that has to be paid. So things have to grow, or just by being stable, by being sustainable, that's not enough for the system. The economy would stagnate or whatever. So the economics, I think the spiritual side of things, the cultural side of things, the way we think, and economics are really core issues that need to be addressed and are being addressed by very brilliant people, even in the world of finance.
Just no one's
and things
listening
like
to
that.
them.
Well, they are being listened to, but they don't get a lot of traction in outside circles because like the well-documented rage machine is profitable, and even if by the metrics, violence around the world is decreasing, though I don't know if that's still the case now. Yeah. And there are fewer, less infant mortality or whatever. Diseases are being eradicated. We don't really know about them. There's this great newsletter called Future Crunch, where they document these amazing stories that you never hear about. It's just like, oh my God, I can't believe that all of this huge swath of ocean has just been protected by this country. Yeah. So there are things happening that we don't often hear of, and that on a sort of emotional level, like, and I'm aware of this in myself. Sometimes it's like, I want blood. I want what's titillating and exciting. And
you brought up something interesting, too, because you were talking about the rage machine, which is something I actually wanted to talk a little bit about, like, a ways back was because we've gone on so many interesting topics and tangents, which is kind of like the way this podcast works. But I think I might have mentioned this on the podcast last week, but one of my favorite football writers, Mike Florio, who he doesn't necessarily write about, like, he's just the top football writer and broadcaster for NBC Sports. So he's in a big position of influence. He doesn't necessarily write political things in his columns, but he never shies away from them if he has a thought about something. And he was talking about the Kansas City shooting from like a couple of weeks ago, which apparently was not even a mass planned shooting. It was just two people in a crowd got into an argument. 22 people shot, one person dead. Good guy with a gun argument, people, here. A third person would not have made that better. But what Mike Florio was saying was, like, because, football is full of Second Amendment enthusiasts, and so he gets a lot of really angry emails whenever he'll talk about gun control, because he said his whole thing now is, like, it's just a fact of life that if you leave your house, there's a possibility you might be shot in this country. And he said the only thing that he could suggest to try to get people to think differently about this or any other subject is because people generally tend to get very angry when talking about these things. And so he's just like, have a calm conversation with somebody and ask, why does this make you angry? And then get to the root of the problem. Because like you were saying earlier, Ben, like, asking questions is kind of how you get people to change their point of view. Like, it wasn't like, MSNBC talking yelling heads that got me to reconsider why so many of my family's points growing up were very toxic and didn't make any sense. It was people just asking me to explain my position a couple of times, and then I realized I couldn't do it. And then I was like, okay, well, let's dig a little bit deeper into, like, what actually ticks here. And, like, the search for truth is what led me to, like, a lot of other ways of thinking. And it's made me a happier person in some ways, but it's also made me a more depressed person because I lament all the years that I was like, I'm not going to talk about that because I know I would lose. So asking questions, I think, is, like you were saying, Ben, the best way to, like, get to the core of the problem and maybe just sort of find a common ground with someone.
Right. It's really key. And, as much as people like to shit on safe spaces, for example, not much progress, I don't think, will be made unless people feel safe. And
100%.
Going back to sort of what I feel like underlies a lot of conservatism as a stance is that fear that there are people coming in here who are going to take my job, replace me, steal my property, and I want things to be, like I imagine they were.
Sure. This is what scarcity does, by the way.
I had this narrative in my head about how things were going to go 10 years, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And now things are changing, and that feels threatening. And maybe I don't want to impose and say like that is how all conservatives think, because I know that's not the case. People come to different political stances and conclusions based on a lot of different things, but I feel that a lot of that fear fuels this kind of insanity.
Yeah.
But I don't want to call it insanity to their face, for example, because that's not a way to sort of
fear
open them up.
Fear makes you like just not think rational. Like that's some sort of evolutionary pretext where it's like if you're afraid of something, you just want to get out of it as quickly as possible without thinking about like as a form of self-preservation. And that kind of made me think about like there was a great James Baldwin quote about that, like with regards to like he was trying to explain what the actual struggle and source of conflict between black and white people are in America, and this was like the 50s or 60s, and he said that the root of the white man's anger towards blacks is fear that they're going to take his job, take his children, take his way of life, and the root of the black man's anger is more, I'm going to say this wrong, but like irritation. Like all the black man wants is to live his life and to have the white people out of his way, essentially, so he could live his life, and more importantly, out of his children's way, so that they can prosper and have their life. And I thought that was an interesting like idea. Like the root of the oppressive side is fear, which it always is.
Right, and if we weren't so afraid of fear, and we could face fear and talk and discuss it and be honest about it, I don't think this would be as much of a problem, because there's a lot of, well, I'm not scared of them. I can't admit that I'm afraid or that that's what's there, or people maybe haven't built the self-awareness to realize that fear is operating.
Yeah. That's a very good point.
Where is the message of fear coming from? Who is that messenger? Do they stand to profit some way by manipulating how you feel? I think there's a lot of misidentification of, not to divide the world into enemies and people who are on your side, but misidentification of who the enemy is. And it might not be a person or a group of people, but rather a way of thinking or being, or I know that's getting kind of abstract.
It might be like greed, that might be the enemy, or I mean,
even going beyond, like why is there greed?
Or even why does there need to be an enemy? In a way, because I mean, I understand, as humans, conflict is inevitable, but why is it that way?
See, that's an interesting idea too, like the concept, because so my ex-girlfriend with the kids, one of the things she liked to show them, like as far as media, like as cartoons and things, which I thought was an interesting idea, was she didn't like things that had like bad guys in them, and especially like cartoonish, weird term to use for cartoons, but bad guys, which is why, and I've noticed this recently, like lots of trends in Disney movies, for instance, there isn't really a Maleficent or a really big bad that's inspiring and motivating the progress of the story. Like a good example is Encanto, where Encanto doesn't actually have a bad guy in the entire movie. It's really just the family dealing with their own trauma. And guess what? It's still a really entertaining and fantastic movie. Like you don't necessarily, and this is something we kind of do with Offbeats a little bit too, Ben, is we kind of, there doesn't necessarily have to be an antagonist in our stories. We can kind of just like flop around on stage without having to worry about a bad
which
guy.
We do.
Yeah.
we do a lot of flopping.
So much flopping.
Well, it's flopping that lands, though. Mm-hmm. And I want to give you kudos, Hal, for you and Katrina were the only people who built a relationship in your scene.
I still don't know what we were doing.
The rest of us were just like, transaction scene, all those those rules of improv. We just blew past them. But
rules of improv are very, very overrated, in my opinion, because the thing is, like, and actually I hear this as a critique because the stand-up people really, as Shannon can tell you, don't really like the improv people that much. There are a lot of digs at improv people, and occasionally I'll see an improv show where I'm like, oh yeah, they're right. Because, and this is, like, I love the improv theater. That's where, like, I got my start in comedy, and I love, the best of improv I love so much. But the problem with improv, which is what I've run into so many people with, is that they're, like, when they teach you how to do it, they teach you a pretty firm set of rules, so it's kind of paint by numbers. And in my opinion, it kind of takes a lot of the creativity around it. But where you put it back in is when you understand the structure, you can disregard, well, this rule doesn't make sense, so I'm not going to do this. And then you inject the creativity back into it. But you see so many improv groups that never move past that phase where they're just like still just doing the Harold paint by numbers or stuff like that. And, you know, there's...
It becomes an orthodoxy, and that's because this is what I do. Going deep onto, well, why?
Ooh, I'd like to hear that.
I'm just making some connections here because, for example, like there's a lot of isms out there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know, purism in improv.
Yeah.
Or, but even relating to capitalism, communism.
Mm-hmm. I used to have a book titled Isms and Ologies. That was the title.
And so many different ideologies that come with an ism. And the problem is not necessarily the ideology itself, or not the ideas or the theories proposed therein, but the problem is the ideology itself, or that it has become an ideology, or that it has become an ism, and that people have adopted this ism as their identity.
And now you've ruined it for everybody.
Yeah, and so being wary of, like, is this part of some kind of schema that is limiting the way that I'm able to see? Because I have to. There's nothing that has not been politicized at this point, and it has become like,
even
that's
the green M&M,
right?
Man.
The cup, the color of the cup at Starbucks or whatever.
It
has become. There's no other way, almost no other way to look at it or to move. It becomes this like obsessive anger cycle that kind of feels good and activating, I guess, to some part of our brain, but. But being wary of, like, am I subscribing to kind of a groupthink, ideological, dogmatic, something that's kind of rigid or inflexible, because that doesn't usually work in a landscape or in relationships or I don't know. There's so much to explore about that. I don't have like fully fleshed out ideas about, I think, anything.
That's okay.
Well,
posing the questions is kind of cool.
I think what the best way to look about it, because you were talking about like isms and ologies and all that, is that like doing something ascribed by the paint by numbers like path of doing it is never going to result in success. And the people who are sort of successful, aside from dumb luck a lot of times in business, they did something just a little bit differently. Like a good example I can think of is like, did you ever hear of Warren Buffett's like cigar analogy? Like part of how Warren Buffett became very rich is that like there were like in that phase of investment, like if a company was on the downswing, like people just abandoned it like crazy. And he had this cigar theory that like he could take a company that had been smoked quite a bit, but still had some value in it and try to build it back up before, the company and extract more value before the company went completely kaput. And so getting a bunch of like small wins in this respect by just getting the last couple of blows of the cigar that people weren't even looking for is kind of how he built some of his wealth. In the beginning. I don't know a ton about Warren Buffett. I just remember reading that is like the cigar economics was his.
Oh, there's so many of those. Like, have you seen the garage that Steve Jobs built the first, Mac? I don't even know if he built the first Mac, but these sort of legends that that develop around people and then become canon in a way. I mean, not that that's. I mean, you're using that as a kind of good example of. Proper use of that example, maybe.
Warren Buffett's he's still way richer than any human being should be. And he's one of the good ones out there. Like, he's somebody who's donating most of his wealth to charity when he dies. And he says all the right things, but he's still like... actually, I had the discussion... So one of my mom's college friends, actually two of them who got married to each other, are like hyper rich. The woman has unfortunately passed away at this point. But the husband was the head of a huge hedge fund for Fidelity for years. And he's worth at least $800 to $900 million if he's not already a billionaire. And I was in a sort of confrontational mood, taking a car ride back from a funeral with my parents. And my mom was like, and he's donated so much to charity. And very cynical, sort of confrontational, how was like, how much money does he still have? Well, I don't know, like $800 million? He didn't give enough to charity. And this started a whole argument about, well, they're allowed to keep that money. And I'm like, well, what good is it doing anybody if it's just sitting in somebody's bank account? And it became interesting because there is a difference of like philosophy there. Like my dad in this case aspired to the dogma of ownership that you are in control of that $800 million. You earned it. And if you don't want to do anything with it, that's your God-given right. Whereas like I was kind of like, you know, if it's not doing any good for anybody, what's the point of it sitting there?
Question is, did you earn it?
Mm-hmm.
That's another good question.
Your earning, what is it?
But you see, this is the conservative logic. Is
where has your earnings, has that been built on the back of any other people or exploited?
This
Have
is
you
why
had
Elon
any
Musk is
advantage?
still like canon to these people, is because like not only is he the richest man on earth, but god damn it, he earned every single dollar of that. And like the more I've peeled back, like it's interesting because I still like I point out to my dad, it's like, yeah,
but
the reason Elon Musk
just because
doesn't.
You're jealous.
Yeah.
It's just because you're jealous.
I think honestly, I think I'm a happier person than Elon Musk, and I'm not even that happy of a person. Like,
yeah. Well, you know, like you said about Warren Buffett, I don't know a whole lot about him. I mean, the fact that billionaires exist is probably problematic in itself. But you know, one of the good ones. But there's something to be said for less badism. Mm-hmm. Like it's wholly inadequate. If every billionaire was Warren Buffett, like would the world be a much better place? I don't know. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't be adequate. But where was I going with that? You had something to say, Shannon.
Oh well, I was just gonna say that. Oh God, what was I gonna say? Fuck.
Ding dong, ding.
There's our fuck for the episode, so we can put the explicit.
Oh, thanks for reminding me.
You're welcome.
Fuck tits.
It was a really good point, I promise. Something that I saw on the internet. Aha, here we go.
That'll narrow it down.
Something that I saw on the internet is just the simple statement of like billionaires are unethical, like just as a blanket statement. And like I think there's a lot of truth to that. And even in the sense that like, you know, Taylor Swift, I guess now is a billionaire, and that's, you know, I think that. You know why? Like it's, and I love her. And this is low key the Taylor Swift podcast, but you know,
because she got one of our episodes taken down.
Yeah. Well.
What?
Yeah, we made a mistake when we put one of her songs in one of our...
The algorithm took down our episode.
But I guess I think it's a statement that makes you think. It's like, okay, well, when you start to put faces to it, you're like, okay, you know... It's you know, we say, okay, being a billionaire is unethical, and it's like, okay, well, let's name the billionaires, and do we think that this person is more deserving of being a billionaire than this other person? And that's kind of where we fall into this chaos of like, okay, did you earn it, and what does that look like? And that actually makes me more depressed than anything else, I think.
It's funny you mention that because I actually did the same thing I did with my mom's friend with Taylor Swift this week, because she donated $100,000 to the family of the woman who died in that shooting.
Which is a drop in the bucket.
It is. Like, again, as Ben was saying,
sweet,
less
a human
badism.
interest story. Well, the thing is also like, oh, they're so wonderful because they donated to charity. But a lot of charity... you know, trace the roots of that charity. Many times they are an offshoot of like, so Walmart creates all this destruction, and then they have a philanthropic arm that, you know, you can donate to, or they use certain, I don't know, financial products.
Would you like to round up to donate to something
to fix problems that they created?
Well, and that's something that I just kind of, it finally clicked for me, and I didn't think about it until I guess somebody kind of put it in front of me black and white, where, you know, I'd be at the grocery store and I'd be, you know, doing the grocery thing at the self-checkout or whatever, and they'd be like, do you want to round up for the Children's Miracle Network or whatever?
It's like, why don't you round up, motherfucker?
Well, that's
Giant, you've made billions in profit this year.
Well, I'm thinking to myself, like, it's just a couple cents. And I'm like, okay, I'm doing a good thing. And then I realized, like, oh, wait, like, I'm doing your work for you. I'm doing your philanthropy.
From self-checkout, so I'm also doing your work for you.
You know, so I'm just like, well, I should just support those places directly, and so now I don't round up anymore. But that was
tying this back to therapy is again this. It's existing in this. I almost hate using the word narrative because it's such an academic, like, annoying word.
Back in the narrative.
And it's like I'm speaking to you through my septum piercing, like looking down at you. When I say the narrative, like, let me unpack this for you. Like, don't tell anybody you're going to unpack something for
A good point that Ben is kind of accidentally making right now, too, is that, like, nothing, like, even the most serious people who have the same line of thinking as a lot of us are not immune from ridicule because
Right.
they're
Absolutely not. We all have our blind spots.
Yeah.
And then, once we notice them, we're like, how could I ever have thought the way that I did or not see that? It's
It's how
so
you
obvious
grow.
to me now.
Right.
But it is how you grow, and it's okay.
I think something you were kind of heading towards was like you feel like anything you do isn't good enough in terms of like. So for me, I'll be like, oh, I'm going to go buy from these people because they're a small business and I'll feel good about that. But then I'll order something on Amazon. And so like you feel like the net goodness that came out of your life in that day, it comes out to zero or negative.
Yeah.
And you start to put a lot of like your self-worth onto like how much you're putting into the community, into
We do what we can. But
the impact.
As I've heard it put before, we've inherited a system where it's impossible not to do harm.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
hurts, especially if you're kind of a sensitive person.
There's no
with-
ethical
with a good
consumption
heart.
in this society.
We've talked about that before. There's no ethical consumption under capitalism.
Well, that was a major
And-
plot
and-
point of The Good Place was that, everybody was getting very bad points added to their score just for like buying a tomato, for instance. Even though the act of buying a tomato is not inherently unethical, it was like sourced from a farm that was destroying the
Right.
soil by a laborer who was being paid a cent essentially to pick it. So there was no ethical consumption of the tomato that you would buy at the grocery store.
And sometimes it's a little bit impractical in what we call modern life, which honestly is the aberration compared to the last, all of since there were Homo sapiens sapiens. Like this is different. So when people are like, "Well, this is the way it's always been," no. Like this
Right,
is
yeah.
the weird part.
Well, that's the thing. I think about this all the time. I'm like, how did we get here? And I just think about this for hours, where I go back in time in my brain, and I'm like, how did we get from living in caves to now I have to worry about getting a mortgage? Like these things are just so complicated now, and
This is actually a major plot point of Sandman, strangely enough. Is
well,
that,
fair
like,
enough.
Yeah.
But I think it's so funny. I saw something on the internet again that was like an asteroid or a meteorite or whatever took out the dinosaurs. You think you're better than a stegosaurus? Like we could still be wiped out. And that's kind of like calming in a way to me. I don't know. Like
It kind of cuts down any hubris or
right.
not saying that you got hubris, but it's calm.
We all
It's
have
humbling,
hubris.
and I think it's valued to be humbling.
It's like, no,
to
I'm
be
not
humble.
better than a stegosaurus. Like I recognize
Well,
I
we're
could be wiped
definitely
out.
different. I mean, we have
Yeah.
this human consciousness that, as far as we know, is very unique. And our sort of condition, you might even call it a curse, is that it's trapped within the limits and restraints of this body. Not that
Yeah.
I want to think of myself being trapped.
We have the minds
'cause I
of
love-
gods and the bodies of dogs.
I love my body. It is starting to break down. I'm dealing with chronic pain, and that has really exacerbated my depression symptoms, etc. Anyway, but I totally lost track. of it.
Anyway,
my whole point was just that, like, I kind of low-key hope the human race gets to start over.
Like Star Trek.
We're just.
I want to.
I'm not saying I want to die in an asteroid, but
So anyway,
No,
we have about 7 minutes
Okay.
left, and I didn't want to cut off what has been an amazing conversation, but I just wanted to give Ben a little bit more time to talk about like good things in your life, like
yeah.
some of the artsy things. Like, what are you looking forward to that you're going to be doing, like with anything sort of like performative or creative? Like, are you going to be in any musicals again lately? Or
Oh, funny you should ask, Hal. I just joined the cast of Plunder and Lightning's A Pirate's
I
Life.
heard a little bit about this from Vanessa.
Yes, which will be opening at Fed Live. That's the performance venue upstairs from Federal Tap House,
yeah.
Yeah.
on 2nd Street in Harrisburg. April 13th, I believe, is our first show.
Woo!
That's exciting.
I've been hearing so many exciting things about this from Vanessa and, yeah, I guess just Vanessa at this point. So.
And I'll be playing the role of Plum Bob, who
I like it.
is a pirate with only one testicle. And he wants to sing you a song about it. So be there.
Thankfully, your range can go pretty like high baritone. So
Sure can.
cheap testicle joke here. So that's really cool. So yeah, you were a replacement for this thing. So you're just getting into it right
They
now.
threw
So
me right in, and they were recording a Good Day PA segment too. He's like, "Do you want to be in our video, Ben?" I'm like, oh, okay, sure, yeah. And he's like, well, fuck it. So they gave me a costume, and we recorded this thing, and I definitely messed up on the words, and my mouth is not, but it's just doing things because I'm trying to make it look like I know the words. But so if you see that, maybe you'll notice, maybe you won't. I don't know. But it should be really fun. It's an original score and book. So yeah, that's one thing I'm excited about and taking part in. The other thing that just started for me this last week is a rehab program, and for chronic pain. It's chronic pain management, and so I've been experiencing chronic pain, and it's hard to tie it to a source, and that's been very frustrating. But I have a herniated disc in my neck, and I have a disc bulge a little bit higher in my neck. I have arthritis in my knee, and I have some mild impingement in my wrist, so sort of carpal tunnel-y. But there's just widespread pain, and a lot of the ways that I used to cope with periods of depression was through activity, exercise, even though just kind of pushing through, or anxiety to do these things that used to give me joy, at least go through the motions. So I had a way of sort of coping with things that was physical and active, and that feels like it was kind of stripped away from me. And it's almost, chronic pain can almost be sort of an imposed depression. Because at least for me, it was like, I can't sit for too long. I can't stand for too long. I have to lie down to rest. Otherwise, it just becomes unbearable.
Well, thanks for sitting with us the last hour and 20 minutes.
Well, thank you.
Then.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm improving. But and it's kind of a mind follows body sort of thing with that. But it's been a long time coming. I could have used this 2.5 years ago. I don't think insurance companies like to pay for this kind of thing because it's intensive and
Sure.
Anything. It's like, what am I paying this company for if they're not going to help me? Or like they tell you to seek help, and then you seek help, and they make it hard as fuck to get help navigating the medical system.
In this country.
There's a lot of banging your head against the wall, and if you weren't depressed and anxious before you tried to seek help, you will be. I promise.
Oh yeah.
So have you ever thought about doing more creative, passive things like writing or stuff like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I feel like I've done it all, and running into that wall has been just so demoralizing. I used to play the piano, and that used to help, but now I sit at the piano and my wrists hurt, and I don't really feel like doing it. And that whatever that reward was, that dopamine reward, I got from doing certain things, it kind of evaporated. It's one of the symptoms in that collection that has been diagnosed as depression is losing interest in things you used to enjoy and not really being able to enjoy them anymore. It's the worst. I mean, being depressed is the worst possible pain I can think of. It is agonizing. It is, to a lot of people, it feels worse than what death would be. And I've been there. I understand why somebody would contemplate suicide. I know you wanted to make this about positive, creative things I'm doing, but
sorry, I didn't want to laugh.
I'm going here because I'm feeling I've been kind of on an upswing. My hope has been crushed so many times that it's just hard to kind of convince myself, at least as a rational person, to keep going. And sometimes this is where I feel like delusion was helpful to me in the past, especially with delusion that one day if I just work hard enough and let my true self shine, I will be successful both in the system and outside the system. I will feel actualized and fulfilled, etc. That was a kind of delusion I now realize.
Yeah.
And but it was so motivating to me, and to be disillusioned, de-delusioned, functionally hasn't been the best thing, or hasn't been the most, in this culture, economic situation, they would call productive thing or way to be. But I do feel like this rehab It's a very globalized program that works on your whole body, not just the one body part that your insurance gives you approval for to work on at physical therapy. Oh, we can't work on this other body part because, like, I had to make 4 separate appointments for different body parts, where I saw 2 of the doctors were the same person.
Oh, boo!
But I couldn't be seen in that visit. I had to leave, come back. Like it takes over your life, and that was
yeah, that's hard.
Like when your full-time job is managing your pain and managing your doctor's appointments and your meds, and it's like, is it actually, like, should I ever have started going down this path of seeking help?
Oh yeah,
because this is not the life I want to be living. I want to create and make movies and do improv and regenerate landscapes and make a living doing it and teaching and all of that. And I just became like, ouch, all the time. Like, I knew it was all going to hurt, and I didn't know if I could stick with it. So anyway,
well,
the positive thing.
You're always welcome doing stuff with us, as always, because you are a good stabilizing and good presence on all things.
So the sort of the positive end to this, or at least bringing me up to the moment, is, well, first of all, days are getting longer, thank the gods.
Only 2 weeks.
And then we'll be away from the seasonal depression, depression, and back to the regular depression.
I do hate to cut off this conversation because it got really good, but Hal's got to go to work. And so we've reached the end of our depression vacation
I'll just say,
podcast.
I'm re-engaging a little bit more with life, and so far it feels good, and that desire to do so is there again, which I'm so grateful for. But it's a very mysterious thing, which maybe we can talk about later. But thank you for the invitation, and I guess I kind of invited myself, but
it's okay.
It's fun. Like, that's a legitimate thing. Like, actually, when I invited Paul Hood on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, I only did it I've known Paul as like a very interesting creative person for a while, but I heard his interview on WITF for The Spark. And I really enjoyed it, and it's a truncated interview. Like, it was only like 20 minutes, and I was kind of like, "Hey, man, do you ever want to maybe be on our podcast?" And his response was, "My friend, I've been waiting for this for a while." And I was like, "Why didn't you just ask me?" Like, for people we like, Ben, it's a very valid thing. In fact, your request to come on the podcast came at exactly the same time that the most toxic request to come on our podcast imaginable happened. And I think we actually talked about that on an episode. It's like, this is a good way to ask if you can be on your friend's podcast. Yeah. This is the worst and most toxic way possible to ask if you can be on a friend's podcast. So you are the example of good in that situation.
Yeah. Well, this is the pinnacle. I have nowhere to go from here. This is like when you finally get to Carnegie Hall and play Carnegie Hall, and then it's like,
for us and our 30 listeners,
come washed up. So this is the end for me.
We're going up, though.
We actually, I posted about it, but we surpassed 100 followers on Facebook. So thank you all for that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ben, for being here. Yeah. And we look forward to seeing you all again next time.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back hopefully in springtime, Ben.
Thank you, listeners. And just real quick, because I know you have to go out.
Man.
I just part of the reason I wanted to be here was to kind of attract an audience, or the right people that I feel isolated from, and so I'd like to give a way to have listeners reach out. I don't know how they can do that, Hal. If they can reach out to you,
or Shannon, or the Depression Vacation inbox, which is where we made our podcast enemy because we didn't know we had an inbox.
Right. So if anything that we've talked about, touches a nerve with you or resonates in some way, I would love to hear about it instead of just feeling like I'm talking into an empty void out there. Yeah. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Ben, so much. It's been Depression Vacation Podcast, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye, everyone.